By the way, today we're having Celestial Seasonings, Black Cherry Berry, not sponsored, for our tea talk, shall we call it. All right, so as you're looking to design your quilts or pull your fabric choices together, you need to come up with your concept in your mind and clarify to yourself, what are you trying to achieve? And if these are the words you're using to describe your quilt, you're looking for contrast. Pop, sharp, shape, design, crisp, emphasize. And if you're trying to talk to people with your piecing, you need contrast. So you want to show it. Then, on the other side of the coin, if you're describing your ideal quilt finish in your mind that you're looking for, if you're saying words to yourself like texture, smooth, even, blurred, chaos, if you want to emphasize novelty fabrics and sometimes make the story more about the color or the fabric than about the piecing story, then you might be looking to soften your contrast. So you either want to see the contrast or soften the contrast. So if you are looking to soften the contrast, then you want to use fabrics that are similar and blend into each other. You might want to use chaos to hide the piecing story and de-emphasize the piecing. This is going to use chaos to hide it. This is going to use similarity to hide it. If I'm sort of blending really similar hues together. Not every single color in the room needs to show up in the quilt. You might be emphasizing a certain color. And then to tell the story in the quilt, not every single color from the quilt needs to go in every single fabric in the quilt. So the quilt plays its little role in the room, and then each fabric plays its little role in the quilt. So they're all team players to the next level. And if they all try to do too much and be everything, then you start to compete and you start to become chaotic. Okay, so I'm going to pull some different fabrics that I used in my initial demonstration, and we're going to do a little example. So this puppy paw fabric, I would largely say if I were grouping my fabrics by color, this would go into the black category. But this puppy paw print is fairly large scale, and it's a softened black by introducing light and medium tones on the black. So the saturation goes down. This is going to give me less contrast and more confusion than a solid black. So let's take a look. So let's say I have this red fabric and I'm doing some piecing and I'm trying to create some contrast here. Here is black. That's a very sharp, clear contrast. I'm going to definitely see my piecing distinction between these two. And then if I were to use this puppy paw fabric as my black, you see that it's still a good contrast. This is still definitely black. If I were grouping these red group, black group, no question there. But you see how this large scale print softens the amount of contrast. It makes it a little less clear and a little less sharp, and it starts to muddy it down, which you may want, but you're moving in a direction, you're creating softness. Now, if I were including some grays and whites along with this, you can see how it's further confusing the contrast level and bringing it down, as opposed to a fabric like this black. So small scale, fewer different colors going on. It doesn't have any white in it. So the amount of contrast between this red and this black is closer to this. So it's just a little bit of texture. We've taken the edge off the black a little bit, but we're still keeping a really crisp contrast. And then if I were using some whites and some mid-grays against this, I'm still going to maintain my contrast. If I'm using this against white and my seam goes right through a white puppy paw, I'm not getting a clear and crisp color story around these gray and white lighter puppy paws. And they're big enough, if you're using a small triangle, that it can significantly start to muddy up your shapes. So if you're going to use a fabric like this and you want contrast, you have to use it sparingly. You have to use it in your larger scale pieces. So you have to look at the piecing and see how big. And if it's a bunch of teeny tiny itty bitty triangles, you're going to have some white ones. And you have to think about if you're willing to accept the amount of chaos and softening that a fabric like this is going to bring to that particular part of that particular fabric. The other thing you could do is actually edge this similar to the little leading that they put on stained glass to be able to use this fabric but still create a defined crisp edge to get some of your contrast back. All right, so then this one is kind of in between. So it's still what I would put into the black group of fabrics, certainly, but we've got white. It's finer white and it's more evenly placed. So my amount of contrast here, this is a little more homogeneous than this one. So this black is giving me a little bit more even, crisp contrast than this one. And the scale is smaller, so I can cut this small and still have a black fabric. Whereas if I start cutting this pretty small, I might actually have a white dominant fabric. And then it's very confusing. How do I contrast it when it's not clearly fitting in one group or another? So let's put these in order. Your solids are always going to give you the easiest, clearest, crispest contrast because this is clearly in one group. There's no argument as to what color that is and how it reads. This one starts to add a little softening, but pretty clear. From here, this looks like it's almost black. You can't even see the dots from this far back. And there you can kind of make out that it's black with dots on it. So it actually reads as a charcoal here. This one from this distance reads as a little bit lighter charcoal. So that's what I mean about using a light and a dark to create a medium. This reads as a lighter fabric. The black in this and this and this is the same black. This has got some white, this has got some gray. And if I use a big enough chunk and scoot far enough back, this starts to average out to your eye and look like a lighter charcoal and a darker charcoal and a black. So I'm softening my contrast. And the softest or most camouflaged and confused contrast is this one. Because even from this far back, I don't really know what color to call this. And see how it looks lighter than even these two fabrics and chaotic. Even looking at the quilt behind me, it doesn't make, you can't really tell where my shoulder ends and it moves into this piecing. But if I do this, you can see that edge of fabric against the quilt behind me very clearly. And it looks much darker. All right, so that was the black. Now, pretend that in my red group, instead of using this solid red, I'm using this red. So if I were grouping fabrics, I would put this in the red group because I think it's probably dominantly red. But we've got some, this is a black mixed with red, so it's not exactly brown and it's not exactly maroon. It's black diluted with red. And then I've got some white elements and they're large scale. So if I have a seam going through this deer, and then I have this block up against a white block, I'm gonna have, your eyeball doesn't really see the seam as clearly. So this is softer contrast. Put them on my shoulder. Get up there, baby. Okay, and then let's do the same exercise. Here is solid black. Pretty clear, crisp contrast. Even when I have this darker diluted black against it, I think from this far back, I can still see a pretty clear, crisp delineation. Clearly, you can see where the seam is. Okay, now let's go to the next one. We already put these in order. This fine dot is the next level of contrast. So this looks a little bit lighter which reads a little bit closer to the diluted black in here, but I think we're still getting a clear difference. Now we're starting to get busy, and your eye is distracted from the larger piecing story because it's starting to try to take in bigger scale prints here and more different textures here. There's like a lot going on. And if you're trying to tell a very clear, very focused story, the more that's going on, the less you're sticking to a clear story. So that's another thing to take in. Okay, our next one was this chicken wire doodad. So we're starting to get into competition here. We have, this is a pretty big scale print, and close up we're starting to compete. And I'm still getting a lot of texture here. It's not quite as strong a line where this seam is. So if I'm trying to emphasize my piecing and tell a story with my piecing, I'm getting less of a clear story here. You put a lot of time into shaping those pieces and cutting it teeny tiny and sewing them together a certain way, and I'm starting to camouflage that work by getting a little bit closer. If you are doing a fast piece and you just want an overall texture, that's fine. I'm not saying those quilts are wrong. I'm not saying they don't look good, but if you're trying to see the piecing, you're not doing yourself any favors when you move away from contrast. So now we're starting to get chaotic. There's a lot happening here. There's a lot happening here. There's similar colors happening here. You've got white on both sides of the fence. You've got variations of black on both sides of the fence. When I come back here, it's hard to tell, especially if I were like right in that deer, where exactly is my line? You see how the line doesn't look even clear or straight anymore. The other way to think about it is if I were custom quilting this, which is how I think about everything, what thread color would I use? And if I were using this fabric, I'd be using red thread. Clear as day. If I were using this fabric and I'm using red thread and I'm starting to go across these deer, it's gonna maybe look a little crazy to have red thread on white. It'll probably blend on the black, but we're starting to get confused where I would start to say, maybe I wanna go with a lighter, like a cool gray, mid gray, to soften how much it looks crazy on this. So because I'm not choosing a red thread, like red thread, plain as day, that tells me that this is reading less and less as a clear red choice. And same thing with this. I think if I were quilting over, too many fabrics. If I were quilting over this, I would choose black, maybe a dark gray. If I were quilting over this, I would choose black. Because if I cut across one of these dots with black, it's not gonna change this fabric and make it look wonky. If I were quilting on this, I would probably use a medium gray or a deep medium gray, like a charcoal. Because I'm starting to tell a little bit stronger of a story with the white, and if I cut across this with black thread, I don't know. I might use black, I might use a charcoal in this. But now I'm thinking about it. So this is less clearly in one category because my thread color in my mind is less clearly one thing. There's no way I would quilt this with black thread because you're going to have long stretches where that thread is crossing over these lighter puppy paws and it's going to look bananas. So I would use probably a mid-gray. So in my mind, even though this is black fabric, this is already gray. So I'm going less contrast. All right. This is a dilution of black. It looks like it's woven in with some lighter gray colors. So even though, as I back up, these both read as a gray, this is a more clear contrast because it's more smooth and even and homogeneous within itself. So it's clearly more in one group or the other, whereas this one is like more all over the place. So let's pair this with white. All right, so here's some white. And if I put this against a white, I have a clear line. clear and crisp. So if I'm piecing between these two colors, I'm seeing the piecing story. I'm seeing all the detail and seams that I've put in. If I put this fabric, which is technically darker, and it's going to read a little bit medium because it's a mixture of dark and light, but like big chunks mixed together, where this is more sort of smoothly blended. Then I come back here, and I'm not really sure where that seam is. So I'm starting to camouflage my piecing a little bit, especially if this were smaller scale. And I've got this puppy paw up against this white. I'm not seeing that edge real clearly. I don't see a point there. Whereas if I do that with this guy, you work hard to get your points. I know exactly where that point is, and I can see it very clearly because this is more homogeneous. It's a medium, but it's achieved more smoothly. Like if I put these in the food processor and I put black and white and do like pulse, pulse, I get this, and it's confusing. But this one, I put it on the Ice Crush Frappe, and I've made a smooth margarita of black and white, and it's more even, more homogeneous. All right, so now these fabrics I would say are in the white category. You could use these as background. This one has large chunks, and if I unfold it and you see the big scale, you can see how it looks like sort of ripped fabric or paper that's been laid over each other. It's very interesting, very pretty fabric. There's some text here. I love this fabric. However, if I'm using small pieces, I could get a piece that looks like this, I could get a piece that looks like this, a piece that looks like that. Now I'm putting that in small pieces next to this fabric. It's much harder to tell where that seam is. Let's do it this way. So from here, you don't see that sharp edge as clearly. We're going a little more homogeneous here. So there is a pattern there. It is a print, but even this far away, it looks like white tinged with a little gray, like a slightly, like a super light gray, almost white. Even with this chaotic print, I have a much clearer idea where that line is. I can see my point much more clearly on this fabric because it's more homogeneous. It's more of, this gives a little texture and movement. But even this far back, it's gonna look like a solid to your eye. This fabric, while it's fun, and it has more character by itself, it's a little bit harder to use in a quilt because if I'm cutting small and I get this section in my half square triangle and I'm using this as white next to a black, but I've cut this small, and this is supposed to be my white, and this is supposed to be my black, then I have a very muddy, unclear story. The eyeball does not know that that's meant to be black. It doesn't know what used to be there before you cut the fabric off a bigger chunk of fabric. All right, so hopefully those little exercises made a little sense. Here's your like, this is like Amish contrast. White, black, very clear. Now look, in a border where there's not a lot going on, it's a beautiful fabric. I'm not saying it's not a great fabric with its uses, but in your piecing, you're gonna be a little bit careful. So let's do this. Oh yeah, let's put that on the edge. See how there's less contrast there? As we get closer, you can't really tell as readily who's who. Even if I take a mid-tone. So this is fairly homogeneous gray. Overall, this is a lot darker fabric than this, which I would call a white. But I'm starting to get a clearer, more identifiable line there. I can see my seam much more clearly. and then I can see it real clear. Even though this maybe reads light and then lighter than black. Because these are homogeneous, I can see clearly that sharp line. I can see that point. So here are my tips for you when you're looking for contrast. Number one, take a black and white photo and see if you still have contrast with a black and white photo. That will help you a lot because your brain is going to look at the background of a fabric and ignore the print. But in a black and white photo, it's harder to do that. Number two, hold swatches of that fabric up to yourself, back up 20 feet, 10 feet, and then up close and see if you're getting the contrast you think you're getting. You can clearly see that seam at those different distances. And then look at different scales. And I've seen people do a cardboard window, big, medium, and little. So if your pieces for your pattern are 2.5 inch half square triangles, then you need to take a 2.5 inch square and cover half of it so you have that triangle. And you need to move that around the fabric and ask yourself, if I think this is black and I move that little triangle, am I getting a black triangle? Do I agree this is really a black triangle? Versus I'm calling this fabric black and I have this little triangle. Am I really saying that that is mostly black when I have this triangle? Is it really giving me a black color story? Is it really filling that role in the quilt? And the other thing is, if your fabric does not fit cleanly into a contrast group and achieve the goals of that specific quilt, even if it's your favorite, even if you love it, even if it's a beautiful quilt and a beautiful fabric and there's nothing wrong with it, it does not have to be in that quilt. You don't have to have every color in every fabric, in everything in the room, in every fabric in the quilt. It's there to fill a specific focused role, and you can let it be just that one thing. So you can focus it, so you can find the opposite of it, so you can find contrast. We'll see if I can edit this together and make anything. It might be 2 hours of just me cutting the video. All right, well, happy holidays to everyone. I hope that your Thanksgiving and your other holidays were fantastic. I know there's been less content on the channel recently. We've got a lot going on in the shop and otherwise. And I hope your preparations for Christmas and all of that are going wonderfully, and that you are able to find some time in all of the chaos to slow down and enjoy the season for what it is. And that's all. Have a great day. Thanks. Bye.